The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the autumn of 1882, and Owen Hadley had not even reached the second page before he was already moving toward the barn. He had answered the advertisement because his neighbor, Clyde Beaumont, had dared him to over a shared bottle of rye whiskey one evening, and Owen had never been particularly good at turning down a dare. The advertisement had been straightforward enough: a rancher in the High Plains territory of Montana seeking correspondence with women who might consider a move westward. Owen had not honestly expected anyone to write back, and he had certainly not expected to feel anything when they did. But that was before Adelaide Kingsley put pen to paper, and before whatever strange magic lived inside her words reached across 400 miles of prairie and mountain and river basin to find him exactly where he stood. He had received 2 letters from her prior to this one. The first had been cautious and careful, the kind of letter a sensible person writes when they are not entirely sure they should be writing at all. She had introduced herself as a seamstress living in Cheyenne, Wyoming, recently widowed, a woman who kept a tidy house and owned a reliable sewing machine, and had a cat named Theodore who, she warned him, could be disagreeable on cold mornings. She had noted her age without apology, 38 years old, she wrote, which she understood might give some men pause, but she had decided early on in this correspondence business that honesty was the only currency worth trading in. Owen had read that line 3 times, and each time he had liked her a little more. The second letter had been warmer, less guarded. She had written about the winter that was building itself along the Wyoming horizon, and about the smell of wood smoke that she had always loved, and about how she had learned to make pie crust from her grandmother, who had come over from Tennessee with nothing but a cast iron skillet and enough stubbornness to fill a river. She had mentioned her late husband once, briefly, only to say that he had been a good man, and that losing him to fever 2 years prior had left her with a quietness inside herself that she was not entirely sure how to fill. She had asked Owen about his land, about the shape of the mountains he could see from his window, about whether the winters in Montana were truly as fearsome as people said. Owen had written back immediately, answering every question with more detail than he usually gave to anything, and then he had sat at his kitchen table for a long time after sealing the envelope, wondering what exactly he was doing. The third letter was the one that sent him to the barn. She had written that she was plain and tired and 38. Not in those exact words precisely, but in a way that somehow landed harder than any direct statement could have. She had begun the letter describing a morning earlier that week when she had caught her reflection in the glass of the milliner's shop window on Main Street and had not entirely recognized the woman looking back at her. She wrote that the woman in the glass had gray beginning at her temples and lines at the corners of her eyes, and a set to her mouth that spoke of too many years of holding things together by sheer will. She wrote that she had stood there on the wooden sidewalk in Cheyenne for a long moment and wondered whether it was a foolish thing she was doing, corresponding with a rancher she had never met, building something imaginary out of ink and paper when real life had so thoroughly proven itself to be a matter of difficulty and loss. She wrote that she was not a young woman and not a beautiful one, and that she thought Owen ought to know this plainly rather than discover it later and feel deceived. She wrote that she was tired in a way that sleep did not fix, the kind of tired that comes from years of being competent and steady and alone. Owen had been sitting at the kitchen table with the letter in one hand and his coffee going cold at his elbow, and he had gotten roughly to that point in the letter when he set it down with deliberate care, pushed back his chair, took his hat from the hook by the door, and walked out into the pale October morning toward the barn. He saddled his horse, a big bay gelding named August, with the focused efficiency of a man who has decided something and has no further need to deliberate about it. His ranch hand, a young man named Cutter Webb who was 24 and perpetually surprised by everything, watched from the fence post where he had been taking his morning leisure. "You heading somewhere, Mr. Hadley?" Cutter asked. "Cheyenne," Owen said, Cutter blinked. That's 4 days' ride, 3 if the weather holds. You got business down there. Owen checked the cinch strap, gave August a brief pat on the neck, and mounted up in one smooth motion. He was 42 years old and still moved like a younger man, though he had the weathered hands and the quiet eyes of someone who had seen his share of hard seasons. He had come to Montana 14 years ago with 2 horses and a second-hand rifle, and the kind of stubborn optimism that was either admirable or foolish, depending on how things turned out. Things had turned out reasonably well. He had 300 acres in the Judith Basin, a solid house that he had built himself over the course of 2 years, more cattle than he had any right to, and a reputation among the neighboring ranchers as a man who kept his word and did not borrow trouble. "Go on and check the south fence line while I'm gone," Owen said to Cutter, "and make sure the water trough by the east pasture doesn't freeze over in the night. Temperature's dropping." "Yes, sir," Cutter said, still looking baffled. "But what should I tell folks if they ask where you went?" Owen had already turned August toward the South Trail. He considered the question for a moment. "Tell them I went to meet a woman," he said, and he rode. The trail south from the Judith Basin to Cheyenne ran through some of the most beautiful and lonesome country in the American West, and Owen Hadley was well acquainted with both qualities of it. He had ridden this stretch of land in every season and every kind of weather, had watched the light change on the crazy mountains, and followed the Yellowstone River through its autumn colors, and crossed the Wyoming border with ice forming on the brim of his hat in late November storms. He knew this land the way a man knows his own hands, not always thinking about it, but aware of it constantly, a deep familiarity that lived in the body rather than the mind. He thought about Adelaide Kingsley as he rode. He thought about the way she wrote, which was unlike anyone he had ever corresponded with. Most letters Owen received were practical things, bills of sale. Letters from his brother in Ohio, who wrote twice a year with dutiful news about crops and children, occasional notes from the bank in Lewistown. Adelaide's letters were practical too, in their way, but they had something else running underneath the practicality, a current of real feeling that she sometimes tried to dam up and sometimes let flow freely, and Owen found both versions of it equally compelling. She was honest in a way that felt rare. She did not perform cheerfulness or helplessness or any of the poses he had seen women adopt when corresponding with prospective husbands. She was simply herself, and herself was apparently a woman who caught her reflection in a shop window and felt uncertain, and who was not afraid to say so. The thing was, Owen thought, that her uncertainty about herself only made him more certain about her. He camped the first night near a bend in the Musselshell River, where a stand of cottonwoods provided good windbreak, and the grass was still thick enough to keep August content. He built a small fire, and ate the biscuits and dried beef he had packed, and lay back on his bedroll looking up at a sky so dense with stars it looked like something spilled. He thought about what he was going to say when he found her. He did not have a prepared speech. He had never been a man for prepared speeches. He figured he would know the words when the time came, or he would not, and either way he had to make the ride. She had written that she was tired. He understood tired. He had been running this ranch alone for 6 years since his previous hired hand moved on, and before that he had spent several years in the company of grief after his younger brother James had died in a cattle crossing accident near Miles City. Owen knew the particular exhaustion she was describing, the kind that accumulates not from physical labor, but from the constant effort of keeping yourself pointed in the right direction when there is no one beside you to help hold the course. He had felt it himself more times than he cared to count. He had answered the advertisement, if he was being honest with himself, not because of the dare from Clyde Beaumont, but because of that exhaustion. Because 42 years of a solitary life had begun to feel less like independence and more like an oversight. Because he had built something real and good in the Judith Basin, and there was no one to look at it with him at the end of the day and say, yes, this is something. He rode the second day through rain that came in sideways off the plains and turned the trail to a muddy ribbon, and soaked through his coat before noon. He rode through it with his hat pulled low and August's head down, both of them patient with the weather the way creatures become patient with things they cannot change. He thought, somewhere in the middle of that gray, wet afternoon, that this was perhaps a ridiculous thing he was doing. That Adelaide Kingsley might open her door and find a stranger on her step and be alarmed rather than pleased. That she might have already decided the correspondence was a mistake and written a fourth letter to that effect, a letter currently sitting on his kitchen table back in the Judith Basin, while he was out here in the rain making a fool of himself. But he kept riding. He reached the Wyoming border on the evening of the second day, and found a small settlement with a livery and a modest hotel, where he paid 50 cents for a room and another 15 for August's keep and lay in a narrow bed listening to the rain on the roof and reading Adelaide's letter again by the light of a candle. He had folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket before leaving home, and it had survived the rain inside his coat. He read the part about the shop window again. He read the part about being tired. He read the part where she said she thought he ought to know she was plain, not as an apology but as a simple statement of fact, the way you might tell someone the road ahead had a difficult crossing. He folded the letter back along its creases and held it for a moment. "Adelaide Kingsley," he said to the empty room, testing the name the way you test ice before putting your full weight on it. "You are something else entirely." He was in Cheyenne by mid-afternoon of the third day. It was a Thursday. The town had grown considerably since the Union Pacific had come through, and it showed its ambitions in the width of its main street and the brick fronts of its newer buildings. But it still had the essential character of a frontier town, the smell of horses and leather, and the smoke from the blacksmith's forge, the sound of boots on wooden sidewalks, the particular quality of the light in the high plains afternoon that was different from any other light Owen knew. He stabled August at the best livery in town and paid for good grain, then went to the hotel on Cary Avenue and got himself a room and cleaned up as best he could from 3 days of trail riding. He studied himself in the small mirror above the wash basin. He looked, he thought, like a rancher who had ridden hard for 3 days, which was exactly what he was. He was not a remarkable-looking man. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, the same as Adelaide had described of herself, a fact he found oddly comforting. His face was tanned and lined and serious by default, though people who knew him said he had a good smile when he produced one. He was broad through the shoulders and lean elsewhere, the body of a man whose work had shaped him over decades. He put on his cleanest shirt and combed his hair and went to find Adelaide Kingsley. He had her address from her letters, a house on Ferguson Street, which a friendly woman at the hotel desk directed him to with only a slight look of curiosity at the obviously travel-worn stranger asking after a widow's home. He walked there through the late afternoon, hands in his coat pockets, the weight of the letter still present against his chest, even though he had already transferred it to the inside pocket of his clean coat. Ferguson Street was quieter than the main thoroughfare, lined with small respectable houses with kitchen gardens showing the last of the autumn's produce gone brown and dried under the cold sky. He found the number he was looking for, a white-painted house, modestly sized, with a front porch and a wood stack beside the door that told him someone was prepared for winter and organized about it. There were white curtains in the windows. The front gate had a small iron latch that was slightly off true, the kind of thing you notice when you are a man who fixes things. Owen stood outside the gate for a moment. He was not a nervous man by nature. He had faced things in his life that warranted genuine fear. A wildfire that had come down off the hills in the summer of 1878 and nearly taken his barn. A confrontation with a couple of rustlers who had thought his isolated ranch an easy target and discovered their mistake in a thoroughly convincing way. Winters that had tested the absolute limits of what preparation and stubbornness could sustain against raw cold. None of those things had made his hands unsteady the way they felt right now. He opened the gate, walked up the path to the porch steps and knocked. There was a pause. He heard movement inside, the sound of footsteps, and then the door opened and Adelaide Kingsley stood in the doorway and looked at him. She was exactly as she had described herself, and nothing like what he had expected. She was of medium height, with dark hair showing the gray at the temples she had mentioned, pulled back in a practical arrangement that still managed to look like something more than practical because of the particular way the light caught it. Her face was oval and serious, with dark eyes that were currently registering confusion, and a careful alertness that spoke of a woman accustomed to assessing situations quickly. She was wearing a dark blue dress with white at the collar, clearly her everyday wear rather than any kind of company dress, and she had an apron on over it that suggested she had been in the middle of something in the kitchen. She was not, by the conventional understanding of the word, a remarkable beauty. And she was absolutely, completely, the most interesting-looking woman Owen Hadley had ever seen, because every line of her face was honest and alive and present in the moment, and that was a quality he had come to value above almost everything else. "Yes," she said, and her voice was lower than he had imagined, with a steadiness in it that he recognized. "Adelaide Kingsley," he said. "I am," she said, and something shifted in her expression, a calculation, a tentative recognition. "And you are Owen Hadley," he said, "from the Judith Basin." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds and felt considerably longer. Her dark eyes moved over his face with an attention that was not rude but was thoroughly direct, the eyes of someone who had learned to read people carefully and did not see the point of pretending otherwise. "You rode here," she said. It was not entirely a question. 3 days, he said. Another pause. Something was moving in her expression that he could not entirely read, some complicated weather of feeling that she was not yet ready to translate into words. "Why?" she asked. Owen considered the question honestly. He reached into his coat pocket and produced her letter, not to show her, just to hold it, and he turned the folded pages over once in his hands. "Because you wrote that you were plain and tired," he said, "and it seemed to me that a woman who describes herself that honestly is probably not plain at all, and that the tired part is something that can be helped." Adelaide Kingsley looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly, as though she was not entirely sure it was the right thing to do but was going to do it anyway, she opened the door wider. "You had better come in out of the cold," she said, "and I will put coffee on." The inside of her house was exactly what he might have expected from her letters, neat and purposeful and unexpectedly warm. The front room had a good fireplace with a fire burning in it, a worktable near the window with her sewing things arranged with precision, shelves of books along one wall. There were small touches of something that was not quite decoration, but was close to it, a blue pitcher on the mantelpiece, a small braided rug in faded colors before the fire, a watercolor painting of mountains that he later learned she had painted herself on a long-ago summer afternoon. And there, in a patch of firelight on the braided rug, was a large orange cat who looked at Owen with the specific expression of an animal who has already judged you and found you interesting but not entirely trustworthy. "That is Theodore," Adelaide said from the kitchen doorway. "Disagreeable on cold mornings," Owen said, recalling her exact words from the first letter. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile yet but the shape of one considering arrival. "You remember that?" "I remember most of what you wrote," he said. She disappeared into the kitchen. Owen sat where she indicated, in a straight-backed chair near the fire, and Theodore came over and sniffed his boot with great thoroughness, and then, apparently satisfied with whatever conclusions he had drawn, settled himself back on the rug with the dignity of a cat who has made a concession. Adelaide came back with 2 mugs of coffee and sat in the chair across from him, and they looked at each other in the firelight for a moment with the particular feeling of 2 people who know each other in one way, and are now in the process of discovering whether that knowledge translates into the physical world. "You should know," she said, with that directness of hers, "that I was not expecting you. I have not been arranging myself to meet you." "I can see that," he said, meaning it as a compliment, though he was not sure she took it that way immediately. "I had not even finished the letter I was writing you," she said. "The one that I was going to say," she paused, and something complicated moved through her expression. "I was going to tell you that I thought perhaps we ought to stop writing, that I had begun to worry I was building something in my imagination that had no basis in reality, and that it was not a sensible thing for a woman in my position to do." Owen held his coffee mug and looked at her steadily. "And now?" he asked. Adelaide looked back at him with those direct, honest eyes. "Now I am not sure what to think," she said. "A man does not ride 3 days through autumn weather on the strength of correspondence unless he has reasons I would like to understand." "I told you my reason on the porch," he said. "You said the tired part could be helped," she said. "That is a kindly thing to say, but it does not entirely explain 3 days of riding." Owen set his coffee mug down on the small table beside him and turned to face her more fully. He was not a man who dressed things up in language for the sake of elegance. He believed in saying what he meant, which had served him well in most areas of his life and occasionally created difficulties in others. "I have been alone a long time," he said. "Not unhappily, I want to be clear about that. I built something I am proud of, and I do not spend my days in misery. But I have been reading your letters, and there is something in them, something in the way you think and the way you see things that makes me want to know you, not in a letter, in a room like this." He watched her absorb this. She held her coffee mug with both hands and looked at the fire for a moment, and he had the sense that she was weighing something carefully. "I am not a young woman," she said. "Neither am I a young man," he said. "I am 42 and gray at my temples, and I have more opinions about fence-line maintenance than any single person ought to have. If youth is the requirement, we are both disqualified." This time the almost smile became an actual one, brief and real, and it changed her face entirely in the way he had somehow, from reading her letters, suspected it would. "You are funny," she said, as though this were a discovery she had not anticipated. "Occasionally," he said. "In the winter mostly. There is not much else to do." She laughed a small, genuine sound and looked at him with those measuring eyes and then seemed to reach some internal conclusion. "I will tell you something honestly," she said. "I wrote that letter describing myself plainly because I have been told over the course of my life that a woman who is honest about her shortcomings is more trustworthy than one who performs. My mother told me that. She was a woman who had very little patience for performance of any kind." "She sounds like someone I would have liked," Owen said. "She died 6 years ago," Adelaide said. "My husband 2 years ago. My father when I was 12. I have a talent, it seems, for outlasting the people I love." She said this without self-pity, which made it land harder than self-pity would have. Owen was quiet for a moment. "That is a hard kind of talent to have," he said. "Yes," she said simply. They sat for a while in the comfortable and not uncomfortable silence of two people who have things to say and are deciding how to arrange them. The fire settled. Theodore shifted on the rug. Outside, the October wind moved through the cottonwood trees along Ferguson Street, and the sound of it was a clean and western sound that both of them knew in their bones. "Will you stay in Cheyenne?" she asked eventually. "How long?" "As long as I am welcome," he said. "I have a reliable ranch hand, and the cattle are in good shape before winter. I can be here a week without the whole operation going to pieces." "A week," she said, and something thoughtful passed through her expression. "That is a serious kind of week." "It is," he agreed. She looked at him once more with that full, honest attention. "All right," she said. "Then I would like to spend it properly. There is a good deal I want to know about you, Owen Hadley, that letters do not answer." "Likewise," he said, and so it began. The week was nothing like what Owen had imagined, which was to say it was considerably better. Adelaide was, in person, everything her letters had suggested and a great deal more besides. She was sharp-minded in a way that delighted him. She had opinions about everything from the territorial land axe to the proper way to grease a wagon axle, and she expressed them with a directness that he found refreshing in a world where people frequently said what they thought you wanted to hear. She was also, he discovered, tremendously competent. Her sewing work was superb. She had regular customers throughout Cheyenne who brought her everything from mended work shirts to the fancy dress alterations that the wealthier women of the town required. And she ran her household with an efficiency that bespoke long practice at managing everything herself. She was funny in the way that people are funny when they are being truthful, finding the absurdity in things rather than constructing jokes. She had a way of looking at him sometimes with a small, dry expression that told him she had noticed something he thought he had kept private. She noticed most things. It was, he thought, both a remarkable quality and a slightly unsettling one, in the best possible way. He walked with her through the streets of Cheyenne on that first full day, down to the market where she had business to conduct, and then to the bookshop on Hill Street, where she spent 20 minutes in concentrated examination of a shelf of novels, while he stood nearby feeling the perfectly specific happiness of watching a person be entirely themselves in a place they clearly loved. He bought her a book, a collection of poetry she had been examining with a particular kind of wanting, and she had tried to refuse it, and then accepted it with a grace that told him she was not accustomed to people giving her things simply because they wanted to. "You do not need to do that," she said, holding the book. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes and then looked down at the book in her hands and did not say anything else, but the way she held it carefully with both hands told him something he found significant. He told her about the ranch. He tried to give her a real picture of it, not the flattering version but the true one, including the brutality of the Montana winters and the work that never fully ended, and the isolation that was sometimes peaceful and sometimes simply lonely. He told her about the beauty of the Judith Basin in May, when the grass came in and the cottonwoods went green, and the whole long horizon seemed to be exhaling after holding its breath all winter. He told her about the mountains he could see from the window of his kitchen on clear mornings, how they changed with every light and season. He told her about August, the bay gelding, and about Cutter Webb, who was a good-natured young man with more enthusiasm than experience, and about the cattle herd that was the foundation of his livelihood and the source of a great deal of his daily activity. She listened with that full attention she brought to everything, asking questions that were pointed and practical. What was the water situation? Was there a doctor within reasonable distance? What was the road like to the nearest town? He answered all of it honestly, including the parts that were not particularly appealing. The nearest doctor was 15 miles distant. The road to Lewistown was passable in summer and challenging in heavy winter. The nearest neighbors were the Beaumont family, 8 miles east. "It is remote," she said. "It is," he agreed. "It is also the most beautiful place I have ever been." She looked at him steadily. "I grew up in this territory," she said. "I am not afraid of remote. I am asking because I need to know the shape of things." He had forgotten that about her, that her questions were not expressions of doubt but of due diligence. He felt foolish for the brief moment he had thought she was wavering. "The shape of things is good," he said. "Hard in places but good overall." "That is the shape of most things worth having," she said. On the third day, she took him to see her friend Martha Calloway, a woman of about the same age who ran a small boarding house on 16th Street and who looked at Owen with the bright, assessing eyes of a woman who loves her friend and is determined to form a complete opinion before she offers one. Martha served them pie and coffee and conducted what Owen recognized as a gentle but thorough interrogation disguised as friendly conversation. She asked about his family, his faith, his habits, his disposition during conflict. She asked whether he drank heavily, which Owen answered honestly. He was not a temperance man, but he was not a drunk, which seemed to satisfy her. She asked how he had come to answer the advertisement, and Owen told her the story of the dare and the whiskey and Clyde Beaumont, which made both women laugh. "Well," Martha said to Adelaide when they were leaving, "at least he is honest about being a fool in the beginning. That is better than the other kind." Adelaide had laughed again, that real laugh that came from somewhere genuine, and Owen had thought privately that he would like very much to spend the rest of his life finding ways to produce that sound. They ate dinner together at the hotel dining room on the fourth evening, and it was the most pleasant meal Owen had experienced in longer than he could easily calculate. Not because the food was extraordinary, though it was decent enough, but because of the quality of the company and the particular lightness that had begun to develop between them over the days of acquaintance, the ease of two people who have discovered, with some relief, that they are genuinely compatible in the way that matters most. He told her about his brother James. He had not talked about James to anyone in years. It was the kind of grief that he had wrapped up carefully and put away, because taking it out in front of people felt like an imposition. But something about Adelaide's quality of attention made him want to give her the real things, not the manageable version. He told her about James, who had been 4 years younger and considerably more laughing than Owen, who had been the one to make their mother smile even on the difficult days, who had been the best rider Owen had ever known, and who had died trying to cross a flooding cattle river, and whose body they had not found for 2 days. He told her this matter-of-factly and without theatrical grief, but his voice had a roughness in it that he heard himself and could not entirely smooth away. Adelaide had reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Just for a moment, just briefly, but with the full weight of real feeling in the gesture. She did not say anything, because she was a woman who understood when words were the wrong tool, and that was perhaps the most significant thing she had done in the 4 days he had known her. He looked down at her hand on his, and then up at her face, and he thought that whatever he had been riding toward when he saddled August in the October morning and pointed south, this was it. This exact quality of being with a person who understood what things were worth and treated them accordingly. On the 5th day it snowed. An early November snow, light and exploratory, sifting down over Cheyenne with a kind of considering air, as if the winter were testing the territory before committing to occupation. They walked through it together along the creek path south of town, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, Adelaide in her good wool coat with a hat that she had clearly made herself, and which suited her in the specific way that things made by people who know what they are doing always do. She told him about her marriage. Not in a confessional way, but in the way of someone who wants to be fair to the memory of a person who deserved fairness. Her husband, Martin Kingsley, had been a good man. She said this with certainty, a carpenter from Nebraska who had come to Cheyenne during the building boom and settled there, and met Adelaide at a church social when she was 24. They had been married for 12 years. They had wanted children, but children had not come, which was a grief that Adelaide described briefly and without diminishment, just a true thing that had happened and been carried. Martin had died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1880, quickly, which she said was a mercy even as it was a shock. She had been managing on her own since then. He would have liked you, she said, which surprised Owen. What makes you say that? He asked. He had a respect for people who built things with their own hands, she said, and he believed that people who were honest about what they were the only people worth spending time with. You are both of those things. Owen walked for a moment in the quiet fall of the snow. That is a generous thing to say, he said. It is an honest thing to say, she replied, in the tone that he had come to recognize as her way of drawing the distinction. He stopped walking and turned to face her. The snow was coming down around them in its light, considering way, and the creek made its cold sound nearby, and Adelaide looked at him with those eyes that saw everything and pretended nothing. I want to ask you something, he said. All right, she said steadily. I want to ask you to come to the Judith Basin, he said. Not immediately, I understand that is not how these things are done, and I am not suggesting anything improper, but I am asking you to consider it seriously. To consider that what we have built in letters and in this week together is a real thing, and that I would like very much to see whether it becomes more than that. Adelaide was quiet for a moment, looking at him with that full attention. Owen, she said, and his name in her voice was something he registered in his chest. "I have been considering it since the morning you knocked on my door." "And," he said, "and I am not a woman who does things precipitously," she said. "I would like to do this properly. I would like you to write to me still after you go back, and I would like to come to the Judith Basin in the spring when the roads are passable and see this place you have described. And then we will see what we will see." It was not the immediate yes that some part of him had wanted, but it was better than that because it was real and considered and came from a woman who meant what she said. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she agreed. He reached out and took her hand where it rested at her side, and she let him hold it, and they stood for a moment in the snow on the bank of the creek, with the whole wide gray sky over Wyoming above them. And Owen felt something inside himself that he had not felt in a very long time, a sense of direction, a knowing where north was. He rode back to the Judith Basin 2 days later, through weather that had cleared to a hard, brilliant cold that made the whole country look like it had been cut out of glass. He rode with Adelaide's 4th letter, the one she had pressed into his hand on the porch when he was leaving, the one she had written before he arrived, which she had finished, and given him to read on the road, folded carefully inside his coat. He had read it at the first camp in the light of his fire, and found that it said almost exactly what she had told him on the porch in different words, that she had been about to step back from the correspondence, that she had been afraid of building something unreal, that she was not sure she had the energy for hoping any more. And then, in her precise and honest hand, the line that he had read 3 times, "I think what I am most afraid of is not that you will disappoint me, but that you will not, and that I will have to decide what to do with that." He folded the letter carefully and put it back in his pocket and lay back and watched the stars over Montana and thought about spring. The winter was long, as Montana winters always were, demanding and beautiful in equal measure, the kind of season that clarified things. Owen worked through it with the same methodical competence he brought to every season, keeping the cattle alive and the barn sound and the house warm against temperatures that dropped to 30 below in January and stayed there for weeks. Cutter Webb, to his credit, had grown into his responsibilities during Owen's absence and had managed the south fence line and the water troughs with commendable diligence. Owen told him so, which caused Cutter to look more surprised than was probably warranted, and he wrote to Adelaide. He wrote to her every week, sometimes more. He wrote about the weather and the cattle and the particular quality of winter silence in the Judith Basin, which was a complete silence when the wind dropped, a silence so full it had a kind of weight. He wrote about the mountains, how they looked in the winter moonlight like something from another world. He wrote about the book he was reading. She had lent him a novel from her shelf, a battered copy of something she loved, with her small pencil marks in the margins that he read as carefully as the text itself, because her notations were another form of her voice. He wrote about James sometimes, which surprised him, but she had asked once about his brother in a letter, and the asking had loosened something that he found he wanted to talk about. Adelaide wrote back with the same regularity and the same quality he had come to depend on. She wrote about her winter in Cheyenne, about her sewing work, and Martha Calloway and Theodore's opinions on the snow. She wrote about the town's various dramas, a dispute between 2 neighboring merchants that had been running since August and showed no signs of resolution, a dance at the church hall that she had attended partly out of social obligation, and partly because Martha had insisted, and which had been, she reported, notable mainly for the spectacular failure of the punch to remain non-alcoholic despite the best efforts of the committee. She wrote about books she was reading, about things she had been thinking about in the long winter evenings, about the shape of her days. She wrote once, in a letter that arrived in February, about a morning when the snow had come down overnight and covered everything, and she had stood at her kitchen window in the early light looking at the unbroken whiteness of her yard and thought, with a feeling she could not entirely name, of the Judith Basin and the mountains Owen had described, and wondered what they looked like under that same snow. Owen read that letter twice and then went and looked out his own kitchen window at the mountains and thought about her looking out her window at her snow, and the distance between them had felt simultaneously like nothing and like everything. He had a visitor in March. His neighbor Clyde Beaumont rode over from the east side of the basin, bundled against the last of the hard winter, and came in for coffee and the kind of neighbor conversation that was part social call and part practical exchange of information. Clyde was 50, wide-shouldered and amiable, with a wife named Nell who made quilts and raised 6 children with apparent ease. He had heard, through the particular telegraph system of neighboring ranches that did not require any actual wire, that Owen had gone to Cheyenne in the autumn. "Word is you went to see that woman you were corresponding with," Clyde said, with a large amount of satisfaction that he did not bother to conceal. "Word travels," Owen said. "This is the basin," Clyde said simply. "So how was she?" Owen thought about how to answer this. He thought about Adelaide on the creek bank in the snow, and Adelaide's hand on his at the dinner table, and Adelaide saying spring in her steady voice. "She was exactly as I hoped," he said. "More, in fact." Clyde's satisfaction doubled in an entirely genuine way. "Glad to hear it," he said. "Nell will be glad to hear it too. She has been after me for years to tell you that a man living alone that long is bad for his character." "Nell is usually right," Owen acknowledged. "She is. It is occasionally inconvenient." Clyde drank his coffee. "So what happens next?" "She is coming in the spring," Owen said. "To see the place." Clyde nodded approvingly. "If she suits, she suits," he said. "And if she comes all the way from Cheyenne to look at the Judith Basin in the spring thaw, she is probably serious." "That is roughly my assessment," Owen said. Adelaide arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of May, on the stage from Lewistown, which was the nearest point the stage ran to Owen's ranch. He met her at the Lewistown stage stop in the buckboard. He had cleaned and maintained with a degree of care that he would have found embarrassing to admit to, with August hitched alongside one of his other horses, a steady dun mare named Clara. She stepped down from the stage with a traveling bag in one hand and Theodore in a slatted wooden carrier in the other, and the look on her face when she saw him was a look he kept in his memory like a stone you keep in your pocket, tangible and solid and worn smooth from handling. "You brought the cat," he said. "I could hardly leave him," she said. "He would have been intolerable with Martha. He does not respect her furniture." Owen took her bag and the cat carrier and helped her up onto the buckboard seat, and they drove south out of Lewistown toward the basin through a May morning that was doing everything May in Montana was capable of, which was considerable. The grass was a green so intense it looked almost artificial against the deep blue sky, and the cottonwoods along the creek were in full leaf, and the mountains ahead of them stood up clean and snow-capped against the morning in exactly the way he had described in all those winter letters. Adelaide was quiet for a while, looking at it all. "It is how you said it would be," she said finally. "I tried not to exaggerate," he said. "You did not exaggerate," she said, and in her voice was something he heard as the specific sound of a person being moved by something and not fighting it. The ranch house sat in a bend of the lower bench land with the mountains to the west and a long view to the east over the basin, and when they came over the last rise and it appeared below them in the morning light, Adelaide put her hand briefly on Owen's arm, just for a moment, just the way she had put her hand on his at the dinner table in Cheyenne, with that weight of real feeling. "It is a good house," she said. "It needs work in places," he said honestly. "The north side wants new chinking, and the kitchen floor has a soft board I have been meaning to replace." "I can see the good bones from here," she said. He showed her the place properly. The house, which was larger than she had perhaps expected, 4 rooms, solid built, with good windows and a kitchen that faced east for the morning light. The barn, where August and Clara and the 2 draft horses lived in their stalls. The pastures where the cattle were spread in the spring grass. The kitchen garden which he had planted but, he admitted, did not manage with much sophistication. The spring that fed the water system, clean and cold. The view from the small rise behind the house where, on a clear day, you could see perhaps 30 miles of the basin laid out below you like a map of everything good and difficult and endless about this country. She stood on that rise in the May afternoon with the wind in her hair and looked out over it all for a long time. Cutter Webb had made himself scarce with the discreet intelligence that Owen had not quite expected from a 24-year-old, staying busy in the far pasture. Nell Beaumont had sent over a covered dish and a note that said, in her forthright way, that she expected an introduction soon. Theodore had been released from his carrier and had immediately investigated the entire house with the systematic thoroughness of a cat conducting a property survey, and appeared to have concluded that the arrangement was acceptable. "What do you think?" Owen asked. Adelaide turned from the view and looked at him. The wind had pulled some strands of hair loose from her arrangement, and her cheeks were colored with the May cold, and she looked like herself, which was the most important thing. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have been afraid for a long time, not of anything specific, just afraid the way you become afraid when things have not gone well and you have not had anyone to stand beside you when they did not. And I think I have been letting that fear make my decisions, and that it was going to tell me to go back to Cheyenne and be safe in the life I already know." Owen waited. His heart was doing something he chose not to analyze. "But I think," she continued, and something settled in her voice and in her face, a decision being made in real time, "that this is a place I could love. And I think you are a person I already do to the degree that I know you, and I think the fear is lying to me the way it usually is." "Adelaide," he said. "I have one condition," she said. "Name it," he said immediately. "I would like to be married properly," she said. "Not because of convention, though convention is not nothing, but because I want the weight of it. I want the real thing." "That is not a condition," he said. "That is exactly what I want." She looked at him for another moment with those eyes that had seen him clearly from the beginning, and then she smiled, not the brief small smile he had coaxed from her before, but the full version of it, the one that changed the entire landscape of her face. "Then we are agreed," she said. They were married in June. It was a small wedding by the standards of some, but exactly the right size by the standards of Adelaide and Owen, who were both people who believed in substance over ceremony, without dismissing the ceremony's proper weight. Martha Calloway came up from Cheyenne on the stage, bringing with her a cake she had made herself, and a hat she had apparently purchased specifically for the occasion, wide-brimmed and decorated with flowers that she wore with the air of a woman who has decided to be festive and will brook no argument about it. Nell and Clyde Beaumont came from their ranch, and Nell brought 3 of her 6 children and a quilt she had made for the occasion that was so beautifully constructed it made Adelaide put her hand over her mouth for a moment when she opened it. The minister came from Lewistown, a straightforward man named Reverend Cole, who conducted the service with dignity and no unnecessary elaboration, which suited both parties. Adelaide wore a dress she had made herself over the preceding weeks, not a traditional wedding dress, exactly, but something between that and a fine everyday dress, in a deep cream wool that suited her coloring in the way she probably could have predicted as a woman who had spent 20 years working with fabric. She had done something with her hair that Owen could not describe technically, but which made it look like everything it was, the dark and gray together, and she wore no jewelry except small pearl earrings that had been her mother's. Owen wore his best clothes and had borrowed a cravat from Clyde Beaumont that he felt moderately ridiculous in, and which Nell Beaumont tied for him, with the efficient kindness of a woman who has dressed 6 children and considers neckwear a subproblem. They stood in the front room of the ranch house, in front of the good fireplace that Owen had built, and said the words to each other in front of the small gathering with the mountains visible through the window and the June air coming in at the door. And Owen looked at Adelaide while they spoke, and she looked at him, and neither of them looked away. "I do," he said. "I do," she said, steady as bedrock. Reverend Cole pronounced them married, and Cutter Webb, who was standing in the back and had gotten somewhat sniffly over the proceedings, started the applause with a vigor that required Nell Beaumont to look at him with gentle amusement. Martha Calloway, holding her slice of cake, leaned over to Adelaide after the ceremony and said in a low voice, "He is even better than I thought from your letters, and from the interrogation I gave him in November." "You did interrogate him," Adelaide agreed, in the tone of mild rebuke that she deployed with Martha and that Martha always ignored completely. "It is what friends are for," Martha said contentedly, and ate her cake. They spent the first months of their marriage learning the particular geography of a shared life, which was more complex and more rewarding than either of them had expected, and both of them had expected it to be complex and rewarding. Adelaide took to the ranch with the same methodical competence she brought to everything. She organized the kitchen in a way that made it substantially more functional than it had been. She set up a sewing corner in the front room where the light was good. She took over management of the kitchen garden with a focused intention that produced results within weeks. She learned the cattle's habits and the seasonal rhythms of the place with the attentiveness of someone who has decided to understand the thing they have taken on. She also, quietly and without fanfare, made the house into something it had not quite been before, not by replacing anything Owen had done or dismissing his arrangement, but by adding herself to it in the way a second river joins the first and makes a larger thing. A blue pitcher on the kitchen windowsill, books on the shelf alongside his, the sound of her moving through the morning house while he was still pulling on his boots. Theodore, positioned in the kitchen in the morning sun, regarding the whole enterprise with the philosophical calm of a cat who has decided his territory suits him. Owen found that being married to Adelaide was almost precisely what he had imagined it might be, and also entirely nothing like he had imagined, because the imagining had been done in the absence of actual Adelaide, and actual Adelaide was more specific and surprising and present than any imagining could accommodate. She was exacting in ways that made him sharper. She was funny in the dry, quiet way that you had to be paying attention to catch, which he always was. She argued with him when she thought he was wrong, which was more often than he had been argued with in the whole of his previous solitary life, and was nearly always either correct or raising a point worth serious consideration. She was also, in the privacy of the life they built together, a person of more warmth and feeling than her public steadiness suggested. Not that she was ever other than herself. She did not have a public face and a private one, which was one of the things he most valued about her, but the particular tenderness of her, the depth of her care for the people and things she had decided to love. That was something he had glimpsed in the letters and now lived with in full, and it was not a small thing. In August, she told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, with the same directness she brought to every important communication, and then she watched his face with an attention that had in it both hope and the careful guarding of hope that long practice in loss had taught her. He crossed the kitchen and took her hands in his and held them and looked at her with everything he felt fully visible in his face, which was unusual for him, and she made a soft sound that was not quite a word and put her forehead briefly against his chest. "We will be careful," he said. "We will be sensible," she said, which was her version of the same thing. The pregnancy went well. Adelaide continued to work at her sewing, slightly more slowly as the months advanced, and continued to manage the household and the kitchen garden until it was not practical, and then handed off pieces of it to Cutter, who took on the responsibility with a seriousness that spoke well of him. Nell Beaumont came over regularly to check on Adelaide and bring things and sit with her in the way of women who know what is needed and simply do it without requiring a great deal of language around it. Adelaide, who had said once that she had spent too many years being competent and alone, found that being taken care of did not diminish her. She accepted Nell's help with genuine gratitude and without any of the stiffness that Owen had half expected. Martha Calloway wrote long letters from Cheyenne and promised to come for the birth. She arrived in late January, on the coldest week of the winter, wearing an extraordinary amount of wool and carrying enough supplies to have sustained a small expedition, and settled into the spare room with the air of someone who has decided this is where she is needed, and there is nothing further to discuss about it. The baby was born in February 1884, on a night of hard, cold stars and no wind, and was a boy. A solid, loud, unambiguous boy who arrived in the world with a vigor that made Martha Calloway laugh from pure relief and made Owen, standing outside the bedroom door where Martha had firmly placed him, close his eyes and lean against the wall and feel something move through him that he did not have adequate language for. They named him James. James Martin Hadley, James for Owen's brother, Martin for Adelaide's first husband, because she had said simply that she wanted to carry the good people forward, and Owen had held her hand and agreed. James was dark-haired like his mother, and had from the beginning an expression of concentrated thoughtfulness that everyone who came to see him remarked on. Theodore investigated the baby with scientific thoroughness, and then settled in the habit of sleeping near the cradle, as if he had appointed himself to a protective function, which everyone agreed was probably more useful in theory than in practice, but was touching regardless. Life in the Judith Basin in those years was not without its difficulties. A hard winter in 1885 took 20 head of cattle and tested the ranch's resources in ways that required careful management. A dispute with a neighboring land seeker who had attempted to move a fence line onto Owen's eastern pasture required a confrontation that Owen handled with more patience than he felt and more firmness than the man had apparently expected, and which was ultimately resolved without serious incident. The nearest doctor continued to be 15 miles distant, and on 2 occasions was needed urgently, once for James's croup when the boy was 2, which scared both parents considerably, and once for a fall Owen took from the barn roof that broke 2 ribs and put him flat for 3 weeks. That 3 weeks, Owen said later, was the only time he had ever felt sorry for Adelaide, because having to manage the ranch and a 2-year-old and an injured husband who kept trying to get up, because he felt that lying still was a kind of personal failure, was a test that would have defeated a lesser person. Adelaide managed it with her characteristic competence and also with a sharp tongue deployed at carefully selected moments to keep Owen horizontal, and Martha Calloway, hearing the story on her next visit, declared that she could not have done better herself. "You told him he was being an idiot," Martha said. "I told him that he had 2 broken ribs and a hay fever and that the fence line would still be there when he recovered, and that if he stood up one more time I was going to tie him to the bed," Adelaide said. "That is what I said," Martha confirmed. "You told him he was being an idiot." Adelaide considered this briefly. "In more words," she said. In the spring of 1886, when James was 2.5 and had recently discovered running as a primary mode of transportation, Adelaide told Owen she was expecting again. They were on the rise behind the house when she told him, the same rise where she had stood in her first May on the ranch and looked out over the basin and made her decision. It was evening, with the light going gold and long over the grass, and James was in the house with Cutter, who had become deeply attached to the boy and vice versa, and Owen and Adelaide had walked up to the rise in the way they had fallen into the habit of doing on evenings when the day allowed it. She told him, and he looked at her face in the gold light and felt the same thing he felt every time she gave him something real, that specific deep gladness that he had not known he was capable of until she had arrived in his life and demonstrated that he was. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Well," she said. "Tired but well." "The good tired or the other kind?" he asked. She had told him once about the 2 kinds of tired, the tired that was also a form of emptiness, which was what she had described in that letter he had not finished reading before he saddled August, and the tired that came from real work and real living and was simply the body's report at the end of an honest day. She looked at him with those eyes and then looked out over the basin and the mountains going purple in the evening light. "The good kind," she said. entirely the good kind. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him in the easy, complete way of long comfort, and they stood there on the rise in the fading evening light with the whole wide country below them, and the stars just beginning to appear above the mountains, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The second baby was a girl. She arrived in the early morning of a December day in 1886, as the snow came down outside in the particular quiet way of the first proper winter snow, and she was smaller than James had been but, as Martha Calloway noted, perfectly constructed and extremely vocal about her existence. They named her Clara Nell Hadley Clara for the dun mare who had been a faithful animal, and had been put out to pasture that spring with the dignity she deserved, and Nell for Nell Beaumont, who had been an indispensable presence in their life on the ranch, and who received the news that the baby bore her name with a display of genuine emotion that she attempted to disguise as a coughing fit, which convinced no one. Clara was, from the beginning, as different from her brother as two people made of the same materials can be. James was quiet and observant, sitting for long periods with a focus that would have seemed remarkable in a child of his age if it had not seemed so naturally his own. Clara was in motion constantly, pulling herself upright at 6 months, walking at 10, running at 11 with a joy in her own capacity for speed that reminded Owen, with a sweet ache, of what Adelaide had said about that first May on the ranch, that it was how he said it would be. Cutter Webb, in the autumn of 1886, had asked Owen's advice about a woman he had been corresponding with in Billings, a situation that had produced in Owen a degree of amusement that he kept largely to himself. He had given the advice as honestly as he knew how, which was to say that if the letters made him want to meet her in person, then he should meet her in person without excessive delay, because letters were one form of truth and presence was another, and you needed both to know something real. Cutter had gone to Billings in October and come back in November with a wife named Rose, who was 23, practical, unimpressed by the romance of the frontier in the specific way of people who have grown up in the frontier and know its actual character, and who Adelaide immediately liked with a completeness that settled the question of whether the arrangement would work on the ranch. The years built themselves in the way good years do, not without difficulty, but with the kind of substance that difficulty, handled together, becomes. Owen and Adelaide Hadley were not, by any outward measure, a dramatic pair. They were not people who performed their love for an audience or who arranged themselves in attitudes of romantic feeling. What they had was quieter and more solid than that. A thing built layer by layer out of shared mornings and worked through disagreements, and the long accumulation of being known by another person, and knowing them in return. But there were moments, and Owen kept them the way Adelaide had taught him to keep things, carefully and with awareness of their value. There was the morning in the spring of 1887 when he had found her standing in the kitchen with a letter in her hand and tears running down her face. And the letter had been from Martha Calloway to say that Martha's boarding house had burned in a fire, and that Martha was uninjured but had lost nearly everything. And Adelaide had said before he could ask, "We are going to bring her here," and Owen had said, "Yes, of course." And the conversation had ended, and Martha had arrived 3 weeks later with her remaining belongings and the hat with the flowers, somewhat worse for wear but intact, and had settled into the spare room and into the life of the ranch with the ease of someone arriving. Where they always belonged, Martha Calloway proved to be a remarkable addition to the household. She had opinions about everything and expressed them freely, a quality Adelaide had always valued and which Owen had come to appreciate. She was good with the children in the specific way of people who like children honestly rather than performatively. She told James stories with a dramatic flair that kept him riveted, and that occasionally alarmed him in ways that Adelaide felt required a slight moderating influence, and she treated Clara's impulse toward speed as a quality to be channeled rather than corrected, which Clara found entirely agreeable. Theodore, who was elderly now and had settled into a dignified late life, characterized mainly by sleep and the occasional supervisory tour of the property, had always had a complicated respect for Martha that expressed itself in allowing her to scratch behind his ears, a privilege he extended to very few. There was the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, in June of 1891, when Owen had saddled August and one of the other horses without telling Adelaide what he was doing, and simply said, when she came out of the house, "Come with me." And they had ridden up to the rise and down the other side, and along the bench-land trail to a particular place on the creek where the cottonwoods made a gallery over the water, and the light came through in long evening bars of gold. A place that Owen had never shown anyone, because it had always felt like his own private measure of the country's beauty. He had brought the things for a cold supper, packed in his saddlebag, and they had sat by the creek in the last of the evening light and eaten and talked in the unhurried way of people who have time, and Adelaide had leaned against a cottonwood root and looked at the water and said, "You know, I very nearly did not write back to your advertisement. I wrote the first letter and then held it for a week before I sent it." "What made you send it?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, turning the question over with her characteristic thoughtfulness. "I think," she said, "I was tired of making the safe choice. I think I had been making the safe choice for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to make the other kind." Owen looked at her in the gold light by the creek. "I am glad you forgot," he said. She smiled at him, the full smile, the one that had been changing the landscape of her face for 5 years, and that still produced in him the same specific gladness every time. "So am I," she said. There was the winter of 1888 when the cold was the worst anyone in the basin could remember, and the cattle losses were severe, and the money was genuinely tight, and Adelaide had sat down at the kitchen table with the household accounts, and worked through them with a precision that had ultimately produced a path through the difficulty that Owen had not seen, because he was too close to the panic of the immediate problem. She had laid out the plan on paper and shown it to him, and he had read it and looked up at her and said, "When did you learn to do that?" And she had said, with her dry amusement, "I have been managing a household budget since I was 18, Owen. You simply never needed me to manage yours until now." He had felt, in that moment, a complex and warm emotion that was partly admiration and partly the deep specific relief of not being alone with a hard problem, and that he thought might simply be what it felt like to have a real partner. James grew into a boy who was, as everyone could see by the time he was 7, his father's son in the physical sense and his mother's in the intellectual one, a combination that produced a person who could fix anything mechanical and had opinions about books that Martha Calloway argued with happily over dinner. He learned to ride early and took to it with the natural ease of someone born to a ranching life, and by the time he was 10, he was doing real work alongside Owen and Cutter without needing to be managed, just directed. Clara was her own thing entirely. She had Adelaide's eyes and Owen's dark coloring, and a temperament that seemed to belong exclusively to herself, a person of strong preferences and quick loyalties, and a physical fearlessness that produced in Adelaide a carefully controlled parental anxiety that Owen periodically attempted to moderate with the observation that their daughter seemed to understand her own capabilities fairly well. Adelaide's response to this was usually a look. The look was not wrong, he occasionally admitted. In the spring of 1889, Montana became a state. Owen and Adelaide had ridden to Lewistown for the celebration, taking James, who was 5 and old enough to understand that something significant was happening, even if the full significance was beyond him. There was a general feeling in the town and in the territory of things being made official, of the wild and provisional quality of the frontier years giving way to something more settled and permanent. Owen thought about this on the ride home, with James asleep between them on the buckboard seat and Adelaide beside him in the evening quiet. "Do you feel it?" she asked. The change. In some ways, he said, the land does not feel different, the work does not feel different. No, she agreed, but the world around the land does. He thought about this. Is that good or bad, he asked. Both, she said in her honest way. What was done here before the settling, to the people who were already here, that was not done right, and the settling does not fix it just by being official. She said this with the directness of a woman who had thought about it, and it was true, and he knew it was true. The displacement of the tribes from land that had been theirs, the particular injustices of a frontier that had extended itself at great cost to people who had lived in this country for generations. But I think there is also something real about building a life in a place, she said, and wanting that life to stand on legitimate ground. That is what I want, he said. That is what I have always wanted. She took his arm and they drove home through the Montana evening in the particular quiet of people who have said real things and do not need to add to them. Theodore died in the autumn of 1890 in his sleep, on the braided rug in front of the fireplace, which was exactly where he had always preferred to be. He was an old cat by any measure, having arrived in Cheyenne with Adelaide in the early years of her widowhood, and traveled to the Judith Basin in his wooden carrier with the philosophical patience of an animal who has decided to accept the arrangements life makes. Adelaide was matter-of-fact about it in the way she was matter-of-fact about losses, which was to say she did not perform her grief, but it was present in her face for several days in a way that Owen recognized and treated with the respect it deserved. Clara, who had been 4 and had grown up with Theodore as a fixed feature of the household, asked serious questions about where cats went, and Martha Calloway supplied an answer that was both comforting and not entirely theologically orthodox, and which seemed to satisfy Clara completely. They got a new cat that winter, a gray one that Cutter's wife Rose brought over from the Beaumont Ranch where there had been an excess, and which was not Theodore in any respect but was a good cat in its own right, and eventually made its peace with the household in the way cats do, on its own terms and in its own time. The ranch itself grew through those years, carefully rather than ambitiously, which was Owen's natural tempo. He added acreage to the east when the opportunity arose in 1890, good grass land that extended the summer grazing range and gave the cattle more room in the long season. He built a second barn, smaller than the first, for the horses and the equipment that had been crowded in the main barn. He replaced the soft board in the kitchen floor, the one he had told Adelaide about on her first visit, which she had reminded him of periodically in the years since with her trademark patience, and which he acknowledged without sufficient urgency, until finally doing it one winter when the snow made outdoor work impossible. When he pulled up the old board and replaced it with a new one, Adelaide came and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the finished repair, and then at him with an expression that he had learned over 9 years of marriage to read as the specific combination of affection and amusement that was her primary mode of response to his habitual delay in domestic repairs. "I told you it would only take an afternoon," she said. "You did," he agreed. "I told you that in 1884, she said. "You did," he agreed again. 7 years, she said. "I wanted to be sure of the proper lumber," he said, and she made the sound that was her laughing without quite laughing and came into the kitchen and stood beside him on the new board and looked down at it. "It is a good floor now," she said. "It always had good bones," he said, and she looked at him and remembered that she had said the same thing about the house on her first arrival, and her expression went to something warm and private that was just for him. Their 10th anniversary, in June of 1896, was marked by a gathering that was larger than either of them had planned for and smaller than their neighbors had suggested. The Beaumonts came, and Rose and Cutter with their 3 children, and Martha presided over the kitchen with the focused authority of a woman who enjoys presiding over a kitchen, and there was a meal that lasted most of an afternoon and an evening. James was 12, and had taken on a sort of formal dignity for the occasion that made Owen think of his own younger self. Clara was 9 and had been persuaded to wear a dress rather than her preferred everyday clothes, which she was wearing with the air of someone tolerating a necessary inconvenience. Late in the evening, when the children were inside and the adults were sitting on the porch in the summer dark, Clyde Beaumont said, "10 years," in a tone of quiet satisfaction. "I dared you to write that advertisement and you saddled up and rode to Cheyenne and married the woman. Best dare I ever gave." Owen looked at Adelaide, who was beside him on the porch bench with her shoulder against his arm, looking out at the dark basin and the stars. "Yes," he said. Adelaide looked at him sidelong in the way she had, with the dry amusement and underneath it something else entirely. "You had not even finished the letter," she said. "I did not need to finish it," he said. "What did you need?" she asked, the way she had asked him once before, a long time ago, when they were new to each other. He had answered that question differently 9 years ago, carefully, and with the specific honesty of a man trying to explain something he was still understanding. He had a better answer now, a longer and more truthful one, built from the substance of everything they had been to each other over the decade. "I needed to meet you," he said simply. The rest arranged itself. She looked at him for a moment in the summer dark, and then she put her head briefly on his shoulder in the gesture that he had come to know as her full expression of the thing she felt most completely and most privately, and he put his arm around her and held on. The stars over the Judith Basin were the same stars they had always been, the same stars he had lain under on that first camp on the way south to find her, when he had thought about what he was going to say. He had not known then what he would say. He had trusted that the words would come or they would not, and in the end it had been simpler than any prepared speech could have been. She had opened her door and he had told her the truth, and she had made coffee and told him her truth in return, and everything else had been built on that, two people with honest foundations and the willingness to put them together. In the spring of 1897, Adelaide came to him with a letter she had received from a cousin in Cheyenne, and the letter contained news that the cousin's family was in significant difficulty. The husband ill, the money gone, 3 children and a probable 4th on the way. Adelaide had read the letter and then folded it and put it on the kitchen table and looked at Owen. "I want to help them," she said. "Then we help them," he said. The help took the form of an invitation, and the invitation was accepted. And in July, a young woman named Frances arrived at the Judith Basin Ranch with her 2 older children, and the substantial evidence of the third expected shortly. Her husband having died of his illness before the move could be made a sadness that Adelaide absorbed with the particular grief of someone who has seen too much of this specific pattern, and who also knows that grief and forward motion are not incompatible. Frances was 29 and lost-looking and frightened in the way of someone who has had the supports knocked out from under them, and Adelaide took her in with a straightforwardness that asked nothing and offered everything practical. The baby, another boy, was born in August. He was named George, and he was healthy, and Frances, who had arrived looking like someone had put out all her lights, gradually through the autumn began to look like someone in whom the lights were coming back on. Owen built a small extension off the east side of the house that autumn, 2 rooms that gave Frances and her children their own space, while keeping them part of the household. He did this with Cutter's help over 3 weeks in September and October, working in the good autumn weather, and when it was done it fit the house in a way that looked, as Adelaide said when she saw the finished work, as if it had always been there. "You are better at building things than you give yourself credit for," she told him. "I had a good design to follow," he said. She looked at him, understanding what he meant. "You are saying the house had good bones," she said. "I am saying the whole enterprise had good bones," he said, and she shook her head at him, but she was smiling. By the time winter came on in earnest in 1897, the Hadley Ranch was a fuller and noisier place than it had been in the basin's early years, with Frances's children running with James and Clara in the particular joyful confusion of a house that has the right amount of people in it. James was 13 and had begun to have the look of the man he was going to be, a good look, Owen thought, steady and clear-eyed. Clara was 11, and had recently developed a passion for horses that was going to need to be accommodated in the spring with some formal training. A development that delighted Owen and which Adelaide viewed with what she called realistic caution, and what Owen called excessive caution, and what was probably somewhere in between. That winter, on an evening when the snow was deep outside, and the house was warm, and the sound of children was a constant cheerful background to the adult conversation, Adelaide and Owen sat together in the front room after the household had gone to bed, in the way they often did, the two of them and the fire, and the quiet that was not empty, but full of the day settling around them. Adelaide was working on something with her needle and thread, some mending or alteration, her hands moving with the unconscious confidence of decades of skill. Owen was reading, though he had not turned a page in some time because he had been watching her, which he was still not tired of and did not expect to become tired of. "What are you thinking?" she asked, without looking up from her work in the way she had of knowing when he was paying attention to her. "I was thinking," he said, "about the day I rode out to find you." She looked up then. In the firelight her face was exactly as he had first seen it in the doorway on Ferguson Street, serious and honest and alive in every line, and also layered now with everything they had been to each other in 15 years, the grief they had shared and the work they had built, and the children and the winters and the morning coffee and the 10,000 ordinary moments that were the real fabric of a life. "You had not finished the letter," she said. The same thing she had said on the porch at their 10th anniversary, but with a slightly different quality to it now, fond and private, the way things become when they have been held between two people long enough to develop their own warmth. "No," he said, "I had not." "What would the rest of it have said?" she asked, "if you had finished it?" He had not thought about this before, but he thought about it now, in the firelight with the snow outside and the house warm around them and Adelaide's dark-haired gray both eyes watching him. "I think," he said slowly, "it would have said that you were not plain at all. That plain was the wrong word for a face that honest. And that tired was something I understood because I had been the same kind of tired. And that it seemed to me a waste for two people to be tired in that particular way on separate sides of 400 miles, when the problem of it could be approached together." Adelaide was quiet for a moment, looking at him with those eyes. "That is a good letter," she said. "It took me 15 years to write it properly," he said. She set down her sewing and looked at him fully in the firelight, and the look on her face was the one he had been learning all these years, the one that was not performed or arranged but simply there, the real feeling showing through the honest face without apology. "Owen," she said. "Adelaide," he said. "I am glad you saddled up," she said. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the settee, and she leaned into him as naturally as breathing, and he held her in the firelight with the winter outside and the household asleep around them, and the mountain standing up in the dark beyond the window. And he thought that this exactly, this specific warmth and weight and aliveness in his arms, was what he had ridden toward without knowing precisely what it was. That the letter had told him enough. That she had written herself honestly onto the page, and the honesty of her had been more compelling than any carefully composed appeal could have been, because it was real and he had recognized it as real, the way you recognize a genuine thing when you have been looking for it long enough. The fire settled in the grate. The snow came down outside in the quiet way of late winter snow. The house held all its sleeping people, the accumulated loves of a life built honestly in a hard and beautiful country, and Owen and Adelaide Hadley sat together in its warmth and were, in the fullest and truest sense of the word, home. In the years that followed, the ranch continued to grow and settle into its maturity the way good things do, not dramatically, but with a deepening solidity. James at 15 took on responsibilities that were genuinely man-sized, and carried them with a quiet capability that made Owen think more often of his own brother, not with grief now, but with something like pride extended across the years, as if the name they had given the boy had carried some quality of the man it honored. Clara at 13 was, as Adelaide had always predicted she would be, her own complete and formidable person, and the formal riding lessons had produced a horsewoman of genuine skill, who had recently and calmly informed her parents that she intended to learn the entire business of running the ranch, rather than just the parts considered appropriate for a girl her age, and who had said this in so exact a replication of her mother's directness that both Owen and Adelaide had looked at each other afterward, with a shared expression that was partly amusement and mostly deep, uncomplicated pride. Frances had rebuilt herself over the 2 years at the ranch into someone recognizable as the capable woman she had always been underneath the crisis of her loss, and in the spring of 1899 she had met a man from Lewistown, a widower named Samuel Cross, who was a careful, decent man, and who had come to the ranch twice in the spring on a matter of cattle business, and had spent more time than was strictly necessary talking to Frances over the kitchen table. Adelaide had watched this development with the warm approval of someone who has been the recipient of a late-arriving love and understands its specific value. Samuel and Frances married quietly in the summer of 1899 and moved to Lewistown, and the east wing rooms that Owen had built stood ready for the next use the household would find for them. Adelaide was 53 in the year 1897. She was 55 as the century turned, and she was every year of it, and also more than that, more than the number suggested, more vivid and more present than the woman in the shop window on a cold morning in Cheyenne had believed herself to be. The gray at her temples had spread through her hair over the years, and she wore it as she wore everything, without apology and without performance, and Owen had said to her once, on an ordinary morning when the light was coming through the kitchen window in the particular way of autumn mornings, that she was the most beautiful person he had ever known, and she had looked at him with the familiar dry expression and said, "Owen Hadley, you are biased," and he had said, completely and without any plan to correct it. And she had shaken her head and laughed her real laugh and poured his coffee. They would work together on the ranch for many more years, Owen's hands getting slower but no less sure, Adelaide's sewing work continuing with an intricacy that increased rather than diminished with age, their mornings at the kitchen table with coffee, and the easy language of two people who had built a language together over decades. Martha Calloway remained with them and grew older in the spare room with the contentment of a woman who has found where she is supposed to be and settled there without regret. James would eventually take on the full running of the ranch, bringing in a partnership with Cutter's eldest son that would carry the place into a new century with fresh energy and the same essential character. On a morning in the early spring of 1900, when the snow was just beginning to loosen its grip on the Judith Basin, and the first green was visible in the south-facing meadows, Owen walked up to the rise behind the house alone in the early light. He stood there as he had stood on so many mornings over the years, looking out at the long view of the basin and the mountains beyond, and he thought about a letter he had read by the light of his kitchen lamp on a morning in October of 1882, 17 years ago, in which a woman he had not yet met had described herself honestly and without flattery, and told him things about herself that were true. He thought about setting that letter down and getting up and putting on his hat and walking to the barn. He thought about saddling August in the pale morning and riding south. He heard the door of the house open behind him and footsteps on the frozen ground of the trail up to the rise, and then Adelaide was beside him in her coat with her breath making small clouds in the cold air, looking out at the same view he was looking at. "Martha has the coffee on," she said. "Good," he said. She stood beside him in the morning quiet, looking at the mountains with that attention she brought to everything. After a moment she said, "What were you thinking about?" "The letter," he said. She knew which one, a pause, and I would make the same ride, he said, every time without question. She looked at him in the cold morning light, this woman who had been honest about herself from the first word she had written, who had been plain and tired and 38, and had sent a letter anyway because she had decided the safe choice was not serving her, who had opened a door to a stranger and made coffee and told him the truth, who had said spring in a steady voice and then arrived in his spring with all of herself in her hands to give. She took his hand. "Come in out of the cold," she said, "and I will put more coffee on." He looked at her for a moment with everything the years had built, and the work had shaped, and the honest living had made. And she looked back at him with those eyes that had never once pretended to be other than what they were. Then he turned with her, and they walked down the rise together toward the warm and lighted house, and the mountains stood up clean and snow-capped in the morning behind them, and the Judith Basin opened out below in the first green of another spring, and the whole wide sky of Montana was above them, and it was good.